Welcome to the All Things Bright and Beautiful podcast. I'm Jenna DePrima here with my co-host Lydia Shively, and this is a discussion of life, books, and theology from a confessionally reformed Christian perspective. Welcome to All Things Bright and Beautiful. I am Jenna DePrima here with my co-host Lydia Shively, and on this episode we will be discussing Macbeth by Shakespeare. We are using Leland Ryken's Christian Guides to the Classics on Macbeth. We hope that you enjoyed today's episode. So for today's episode, we picked a really nice, light, fluffy book to read. So in full transparency, Lydia and I were just talking about this. I was an English major, so I studied Shakespeare a little bit, but I still feel like really out of my depth, honestly, in reading Shakespeare. And so even, knowing I was going to be talking about it was like pretty intimidating to me. So hopefully if you're just like a normal person out there like me and you feel intimidated by Shakespeare, you'll be comforted to know that I feel that way too, but that it really is so rich. There's so much to get out of reading Shakespeare, but it does require more work, but it's worth it. It's worth the effort. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from. Lydia is much more knowledgeable, I would say, and has probably read a lot more Shakespeare than me.
Disappoint.
But so we're coming maybe from slightly different places.
Yeah, but still, I don't think you'll meet anyone you'll meet like maybe a Shakespeare scholar who's I get it. But right. I don't think you'll meet anyone that's like, yeah, I definitely got all of that on like my first reading through. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of, I had to switch my brain to reading more, it's reading poetry essentially. Mm-hmm. I mean, and so it's just a different, I try to read some poetry, but I don't read a ton of poetry. So it is kind of like shifting a gear in your brain to read it really differently. And I appreciated even in Ryken's guide that we're using, he says somewhere, I think like in the beginning, he talks about how like basically everyone feels like they don't know what every word means in his lines. And that's comforting because I think when you're just like the average person reading this, it's easy to feel like I should know what he's saying here, but I have no idea
what's going on.
And a lot of times it requires further thought or further study, and then it's very rich once you understand it, but it's totally normal, I think, to feel like a bit out of your depth of maybe the first time you read it. So with all of that said, why are we talking about this book?
Yeah, why Shakespeare?
Yeah.
I was reading Ryken's other book. It's called Realms of Gold, and it's just about literature in general and what we can draw from it as Christians. And he quotes T.S. Eliot in it from Eliot's essay, The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism. And I just think what Eliot says is really helpful for understanding why Shakespeare is worth the effort and the time, because he's hard to read. It takes time, even though they're so short, you can spend a lot of time in them and just like really wrestle with the language. So I think what he says is really helpful. He says, in a play of Shakespeare, you get several levels of significance. For the simplest auditor, there is the plot. For the more thoughtful, the character and the conflict of character. For the more literary, the words and phrasing. For the more musically sensitive, the rhythm. And for the auditors of greater sensitiveness and understanding, a meaning which reveals itself gradually. So even just on the first realm, if you can't understand a lot, the action of Shakespeare, there is a really exciting plot. There's a reason a lot of books and movies and plays currently draw from Shakespeare in our culture. And Macbeth especially, I think, is a really exciting story. So even if you're like, you can't quite get all the meaning and you maybe don't get through the depth, the story alone is like a pretty... that is even like a good place to start, I think. And then you can move into the beauty of the words that Shakespeare uses and just his mastery over the English language. And like it says, the rhythm of the language, and that it has this sort of like beauty, because he writes an iambic pentameter, which is like, it's like a heartbeat, and it's like the natural way that people talk. And so reading that, especially reading it out loud, it has that like musical quality.
Right. Yeah. I think another thing that's a little intimidating about Shakespeare is there's so many different versions like of plays out there. Do you have one that you recommend or that you really like?
I chose it based on the cover.
Okay.
Because
at least you're honest.
Yeah, because the one that I chose, I actually wanted something. So Ryken does recommend when you read Shakespeare to read something that has some footnotes and endnotes to it, which I do think is really helpful. But because I was using his guide in addition, I wanted something that was just clean and was just straight the play itself. And so I chose one that was just...
So yours didn't have notes?
Didn't have any notes in it. And so then I just relied on Ryken's notes to kind of understand things.
And I did the Signet, I think it's how you say it, Signet Classic. And they're very inexpensive. So that was one plus. But then also they have notes, but it's not overwhelming, but
Yeah.
they have notes for what a lot of the words mean, and it has like an intro and has some explanations of what critics think about certain things. So that I found that helpful. It can be distracting sometimes. Like I had to kind of discipline myself to like read it and then go back and read the notes again.
Right.
So there's maybe some drawbacks to that, but it was super helpful. There's just a lot of words that we don't use anymore that, you kind of need, or at least I needed like a guide to help me with that. So,
and because it's poetry, the phrasing is like not intuitive necessarily. So it can be hard to understand.
Yes. So another thing that Ryken talks about in the beginning of his guide is why classics matter. And that was one thing that I really appreciated. I thought he did a great job of talking about that. And he just talks about how unlike nonfiction, the subject of literature is the human experience, and that it's it shows the human experience in a way that nonfiction cannot do. And he defines a classic as basically the best in its class. And so he also talks about how classics have stood the test of time and that they really are formative in what has educated people for centuries, and that really is like, it is a way of like, I love this sentence. He says, "We finish reading a classic with a sense of having risen higher than we otherwise would have risen."
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
Do you think, I guess, what were your thoughts on his view of the classics, like, and their role in our life and our education?
Yeah, I think his explanation in the guide is really helpful, and then in Realms of Glory, he has like a little prologue, introduction, I guess, on why classics are necessary, and he are not necessary, but why they're worth our effort and our time. And so he, like you mentioned, it talks about the timelessness of them, but how they're also timely. They still, because they're timeless, I think they still hit on things that are true to just human nature across epochs. And I also think he mentions this, and that it's also they're also really influential for culture. And so Shakespeare especially is really important because he's one of the greatest influences on Western culture, which is, that's where the English language is built a lot on Shakespeare, and so that influences a lot of the stories that we have today. And and just, I think, recognizing that he's sort of a bedrock that a lot of stories and
So we recognize, as we've already said, that there's definitely some challenge in reading Shakespeare. So what are ways that maybe you found helpful in understanding and reading Shakespeare better?
Yeah, I mean, they're plays. So yeah, the best scenario is actually seeing it. But I do think it's still worth reading it for yourselves even before you see it, because every play that you go see, or if you see if you watch a movie that is an interpretation of it, they're all going to have artistic interpretation of what Shakespeare wrote. And so I think there is something to reading it for yourself first, and because then you can walk into that play and be like, well, I actually don't know if I would have taken that direction with that character. And so it kind of helps you be a little bit discerning in how they've taken the story and changed it a little bit, whether for good or ill. But I think that, so reading it is great. Listening to it, also great. I read it, and then I also listened to it on Audible, which was really helpful. Because it is, I mean, it's meant to be read out loud, and that helps a lot to hear it, especially because it's poetry. And then watching it, and I think also, if you have the time, memorizing lines from Shakespeare can be really helpful. So this is one of the things I do with my kids to teach them Shakespeare is help them memorize like fairly not super long portions, because memorizing, if done well, you actually have to like slow way down and take the time to understand the words themselves. And then even if you're not memorizing an entire play or a huge section of it, having even little bits of memorized parts gives you enough familiarity when you're reading it to sort of because I think sometimes you can get really lost when you're reading and be like, I don't know what's going on. But if you have even just like little glimpses of like, oh, I reckon, because sometimes even like if people read Hamlet, they recognize his to be or not to be soliloquy. And so that little bit of recognition can sort of like wake up your brain, even if you're in the middle of something that's kind of challenging. Yeah.
And I've found it very interesting. It seems like you do a lot of Shakespeare with your kids, and even you've said even your 4-year-old enjoys it, which to me is just like, I just have a hard time believing that, because I have a 4-year-old boy and I'm like, I just can't fathom that. But So how do you, like, I guess instill a love of Shakespeare in your kids, and you've mentioned a few ways, but what are some other ways you help them to understand Shakespeare?
Yeah, I really love the book How to Teach Your Children Shakespeare by Ken Ludwig. So he makes the case for why it's worth teaching our children, and he's the one that I originally found like the argument for why memorizing Shakespeare and like why that can help in the reading of it. And so he starts with teaching your kids to memorize it like small parts first and reading the stories together. And kind of like Ryken mentions, your first reading, you're not going to recognize and understand all of it, and your kids won't either. But I think because it's poetry, it's actually pretty attractive to children, especially. So the one that my 4-year-old really loves is Midsummer Night's Dream, and she just loves it because it's fairies. Yeah. And so she's just obsessed with the Queen of Fairies. But even just that little bit of familiarity makes it, when they're in high school and reading it, it's less intimidating because they recall the story and they don't get as lost. And so then they actually have the space to explore the language a little bit more because they at least have a place for the story first, I think. So his book was really helpful for kind of an introduction of how to jump in. Yeah.
That's great.
So Ryken actually makes the case that Shakespeare is Christian literature. Can you sort of summarize a little bit of what his argument there, and if you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I mean, and he really makes a strong case for Shakespeare's Christianity himself, like that Shakespeare was a Christian. And, he just talks about how this kind of prevailing view, perhaps amongst critics today, is that Shakespeare and Shakespearean plays are secular, but that he, I think, does a pretty good job of just showing how that's just completely false. Yeah, and that it's just kind of the spirit of the age to say that. But he argues that Shakespeare's England was thoroughly Christian and Protestant. I mean, the Bible was the best-selling book at that time. People were mandated to attend church, and Shakespeare was baptized himself in the local Anglican church. And then, I didn't actually know this, I found this interesting, he became a lay rector at that same church after he retired. And then in addition to that, he just over and over again, I mean, you can see it in Macbeth and certainly in his other works, the framework from which the whole play is operating is clearly, in my opinion, a Christian worldview that assumes that there is a literal heaven and hell, that there's good and evil. It assumes the same reality that the Bible presents to us. Another interesting fact is that there's at least 2,000 biblical references that exist in Shakespeare's works. So it really is like the themes, the Christian themes and the biblical allusions and references are just all throughout his works. So I felt like, that was a pretty convincing case for why this really is Christian literature.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, we'll get into a little bit more of the specifics with Macbeth of some Christian themes that they really are just all over as you read it, allusions and direct quotes and even direct mentions of God and So 2 of the main genres that Macbeth falls under is first a drama. And so the action is not stated like directly by like a storyteller or a narrative. Instead, we kind of have to piece it together through the dialogue of the characters. And then the second genre is tragedy. And so Macbeth is set up as this tragic hero. And basically, the plot line of I guess, any tragedy is to watch this tragic hero fall from prosperity to catastrophe. And the emphasis is on the tragic choice of the protagonist. And so Macbeth is definitely very clearly a tragedy. And and just because I think sometimes people can get confused when you mention like tragic hero. The term hero there's sort of like this exalted character, as in like hero, like if you think of like Greek gods, sort of like Hercules type of hero. So they're sort of like above and beyond other people in like excellence and that kind of thing. And generally they have a singular moral flaw. Yeah. And that is what leads to their demise in the end. And so for Macbeth, if you note in the very beginning of the play, he does start out as this sort of morally exemplary character. He's beloved by the king. People trust him. And then he just has the fatal flaw of ambition, and then all of the events sort of transpire from there. But it's not that he starts out as this inherently just wicked man but it's like he has this flaw, and then temptation comes and he gives in to temptation. And so one of the things that Ryken says in Realms of Gold, which I think is an important thing to just think about tragedy itself, because sometimes when we read tragedy, I think we might sort of not want to read it sometimes because we
Right.
think, oh, that's really depressing.
Right.
That just sounds awful to read. Like there's especially like Macbeth is a pretty gruesome
Dark,
tale.
yeah.
It's pretty dark. But one of the things he says is that tragedy is the spectacle of exceptional calamity and I don't know how this word is supposed to be said, but like irredeemable loss. That's not what he says, but I'm going to change the word slightly. It makes us confront what we most fear and wish to avoid facing, the destructive potential of evil in human life. And so really tragedy makes us sort of face sin in a way that we probably don't really want to, but I think that Christians should.
So in tragedies, we see, in the end, the morally good characters are rewarded and the evil characters are punished. And Aristotle actually claimed that our moral sense is satisfied only if such justice occurs. So they are bleak and dark, but they kind of give you this sense of like justice being
is
done.
served. It's
Yes.
true. Yeah. So, I guess we've mentioned a couple of different plot points from the play, but I'll just give a brief summary of what takes place, essentially. It sort of takes place, there's already this backdrop because you have witches come in, and it's a pretty, dark and demonic scene that he paints. So you have this sense of sort of an undergirding of demonic and evil forces. You meet Macbeth, and he's highly praised, like I said before, by the king and the king's men. He's a bondservant. Not a bondservant, but he's a servant to the king. The king loves him, trusts him highly.
And he's coming off of like a battle that
he's won, and the king is So he goes to these witches. So he is told that he will take Duncan's place, and
who's the king?
At the time. And then so he takes this like ambition that the witches sort of put in front of him, and starts to sort of scheme for how he'll accomplish that, and then. So there's a lot of like action scenes that kind of take place along the way, but the main bulk of the plot is then his wife gets news of this, and she doesn't believe that he'll have basically the courage, like bad courage, to kill the king. And so she sort of, even when he sort of doubts, like, oh, can I really do this wicked thing of killing the king to take his place, she continues to sort of nag him essentially in order to do this, and even says like she'll do it herself if he doesn't have the guts to do it. And then, spoiler alert, he does kill the king, and then they both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth sort of just devolve into this psychological torment of their own making, where they're haunted by spirits and this bloody hand, and just this sort of this Shakespeare just weaves this dark reality of their psychological torment,
and you see Macbeth's crimes increase, like he starts to think he needs to kill more and more people to cover up this deed that he's done.
Right. So then more murders happen. There's more battles happening at the same time. You have Macduff is another one of the rightful King Duncan's men, and Malcolm, who wants Macduff to overthrow Macbeth, essentially. So there's a lot of battle scenes that happen. There's a few more times with witches.
Good summary.
It's a good summary. And then essentially, Macduff. Sorry, the Scottish names are killing me because they're so similar. Macduff does, in fact, defeat Macbeth at the very end. And so Lady Macbeth kills herself. Yeah. Macduff kills
That's not funny.
Macbeth. I know, but it is.
It's hard to explain.
It's hard to explain. There's a lot of names and action that happen. And there is a lot of like exciting action. One of the things, I think Ryken mentions it, that if you actually were to see it as a play, it was really popular at the time because there's a lot of sword fighting and battle scenes that were happening. And that like for the actual stage was really exciting and popular for theater goers. And it ends with this sort of poetic justice of Macduff defeating Macbeth.
Great job, Lydia. That was a wonderful summary. But it's very difficult to briefly summarize a Shakespeare play. So there's a lot of themes in Macbeth, certainly a lot of Christian themes. And so one of the themes, there's, like I said, there's several, but one of the ones that really stood out to me was the self-destruction of evil and just how, a guilty conscience and how, that sense of guilt, that psychological burden really leads to self-destruction. And certainly that's a very biblical concept. And I just found it fascinating how Macbeth becomes increasingly hardened again, like to what he's done. Yeah. So he does have kind of have a conscience. Well, first of all, as you already said, he was hesitant to murder Duncan in the first place. Mm-hmm. And then he kind of gets more and more bold and starts to, just have no conscience about it whatsoever at all. And
yeah, I mean, he even jumps to killing children, like encouraging the killing of children. And you do see sort of this like snowballing effect of evil.
Yeah, and so in kind of towards the beginning, this is in Act 3, he is just killed Duncan, but he's not suspected of the murder yet. No one knows the part that he and Lady Macbeth play in it. And yet you see in this scene this kind of mutual insecurity that they feel, and it really shows that this guilt and this self-destructiveness of the evil they've done is inward. Like it's not they haven't been suspected. No one has done anything to them yet, and yet they are like haunted by this guilt and this self-destructiveness already. And then later, I found this very interesting. This is kind of a minor point, but it just really stood out to me. It's definitely not like a scene that probably stands out to a lot of people, but later in that same act, there's a Greek god. I think her name's Hecate.
I don't know.
Okay, I don't know how to say it, but she is, I think, like the daughter of Zeus, or I don't know. Don't quote me on that. But
there's a lot of those.
Yes, and she instructs the demons on how to ruin Macbeth, and so the essence of her plan is to draw onto his confusion by instilling a false sense of security. Like the line says, "And you all know security is mortal's chiefest enemy," and that really stood out to me. Just like, isn't that so biblical that the Bible talks about how pride comes before the fall, and how really a pride about our inability to sin, or maybe this false security that we have, that we don't need to obey God, or we don't need to, like, we're comfortable, we're fine, we're just living for this world. That is so what the Bible like continually warns us about. So I just found that fascinating that she describes like comfort, security as mortal's chiefest enemy, and I think that's certainly true for all of us, and that we do need to have a healthy fear of sin and of the sin that we're capable of committing. Yeah. What were some of the other themes that stood out to you?
Yeah, the self-destruction of evil, I think, is a really interesting one, because I think Shakespeare does it so well as you follow Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and they just deteriorate over time in different ways, because Lady Macbeth sort of becomes more fragile, while Macbeth becomes, like you said, more hardened. I think also, like you mentioned, Kate, or however you say her name, and just this demonic reality of forces. And I think it's interesting how Shakespeare does this, because they influence Macbeth, but they certainly aren't the instigators,
right?
Which I think is again another case for a biblical view coming from Shakespeare, because
I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
Yeah, like he has a free moral will, like he's able to choose good or evil, and he's choosing evil,
right? Knowingly. I mean, he talks about it early on. He recognizes that to do it would be wicked, and even seems to kind of recognize what it will do to his own soul, and yet he just succumbs to the temptation. One of the things, again, that Ryken says in Realms of Gold, which is obviously a really great book.
I know, I need to read this book.
Yeah, it's really good. He says, contrary to the prevailing modern view of the person as an amoral set of conditioned reflexes, tragedy, so he's talking about tragedy in general, but I think this applies to specifically Macbeth, but tragedy presupposes that people have a power of choice with accompanying moral responsibility. So you have these demonic forces, but unlike, say, like Greek gods, it's not like we're destined to fall to that temptation. So it's not like Oedipus, where he doesn't have a choice in his fate.
Right.
He makes this conscious choice and gives into these temptations, which I think like you were saying, as far as the warnings for Christians of this idea of security, I think also just the recognition of looking at sort of Macbeth and temptation, and Scripture tells us to flee temptation, and you watch Macbeth and the slow destruction of him and Lady Macbeth, of like, if you had just turned from these temptations that you faced.
Yes, yeah. Ryken talks about how a biblical text that could kind of undergird this whole play is James 1, verses 14 and 15, and that says that, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. And like you just
that's
see
like
that
the play.
On display.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and another thing I really enjoyed was the way that Shakespeare portrays guilt and like the psychology behind that. And I think Ryken says that this is the most famous literary portrayal of the psychology of guilt, and just that Shakespeare, way before we had any notion of like any kind of psychology that we have today, he just did such a great job of kind of laying out this psychology of guilt and kind of the human condition. And I just found that really fascinating.
Yeah, it is really interesting to like the observation of Lady Macbeth and just how like the scene where she's being watched by the maid and the doctor. And
and I want to get more into that because that's a really important scene.
It is. It like I think it's just really interesting to see for him to be able to back in, I think it was written in 1606 or 1607, to have had that kind of understanding of the human psyche and how it deteriorated under that kind of pressure is just, it's fascinating to read it.
Yeah, and another thing that Ryken was helpful, reading his guide was helpful and illuminating for me. I wouldn't have known this otherwise, and I certainly am not a psychology expert, so I don't know. I still don't know much, but he just talks about how the Renaissance view of psychology was concerned with the person's whole nature, meaning like their body, their spirit, their emotions, like it's a holistic view of the person, and that was the prevailing like Renaissance view at that time. And so I guess we since we've already touched on it, we might as well go into it. There's a scene towards the end of the play. It's in Act 5, and it's a really probably one of the most famous scenes, I would think. And it's so Lady Macbeth is she's sleepwalking, and her maid like summons a doctor, and the doctor kind of observes her and asks the maid like what she's been doing, and the maid explains that she's been wringing her hands and trying to wash them. And what else does she do? I'm trying to remember now.
She does sort of she has her own little monologue that's constantly going.
Yeah, she kind of has this like inner monologue, and she's doing all of this while sleeping. And so the doctor just has this really profound insight, and he talks about how what she actually needs is a pastor, or forget the word that he uses. Like
says more needs she the divine than the physician.
Yes. Yeah. Meaning she needs like a pastor more than she needs a doctor, because even though she is having these physical symptoms, her physical symptoms are just a result of her guilt, and that what she needs is the forgiveness of God, not a doctor to cure her. And so, I just think that the whole scene is just a fascinating look into human psychology and into the destructiveness of evil, and just kind of the debilitating effects of sin. And another thing I found fascinating was this reference. There's a lot of like reference to hands in general in Macbeth. Like there's bloody hands at one point. So in this washing of hands, Shakespeare is referencing, he's alluding to Pilate, and in Matthew 27:24, it's a verse that talks about when Pilate takes water and washes his hands before the crowd and says, "I'm innocent of this man's blood, see to it yourselves." And just this idea, like, it was just interesting to me, that illusion of like she's trying to cleanse herself of any kind of guilt she feels, recognizing she can't. And kind of in the same way, like Pilate's saying, I'm going to wash myself of any guilt I have in this, like as if he can do that, And she also, another significant part is that so earlier in the play, she says, what's done is done. Like when summer's over, kind of flippantly, like it's done, what's done is done,
over,
So then in this scene, she says, what's done cannot be undone, which is when like just on face value kind of saying the same thing, but she's having, earlier in the play she had a dismissive tone, whereas now she's clearly wishing that the murder could be undone, and like reconciling with the fact that it can't be undone, so I found that really interesting as well, just kind of the contrast of those two very similar statements, and just shows her progression in guilt.
It is really interesting too that she's washing her hands, because in the way that Duncan's murder happens, she gets everyone drunk and puts in like a sleeping something in their drink.
Right.
But it's actually Macbeth who does the stabbing, so he's the one that gets actual physical blood on his hands, and she doesn't, and yet she still has this recognition of her complicit guilt. And so I think it's just interesting that in her sleepwalking psychological state, she's washing, like like you said, it's that reference to Pilate. And she sort of revisits the crime, and in her monologue, she kind of goes on and on about sort of trying to excuse what she's done and just sort of reliving the events. Yeah, it is a really interesting scene to read. I think also one of the more interesting points was just this contrast of Macbeth and then virtuous leadership. You don't get a whole lot of knowledge about Duncan. You get that idea that he's like a kindly king. Yeah. But in Act 4, Scene 3, Malcolm is sort of trying to discern Macduff's heart and whether or not he can trust him. And so he pretends to be as wicked as Macbeth, but at one point he names all the virtues of what a leader should be like, and he says the king becoming graces as justice, verity, temperance, stableness, bounty, perseverance, mercy, lowliness, devotion, patience, courage, fortitude. And I think just seeing that, even just that list of virtues, and then seeing Macbeth is such an interesting contrast of seeing, leadership that is what we kind of all desire. We all desire a leadership that looks like what Malcolm describes, and then seeing Macbeth, who's so wickedly ambitious and has no care for people underneath him or above him, for that matter. Yeah.
Yeah, and it really is a transcendent theme. Like, don't we today still wrestle with longing for virtuous leadership, and yet seeing how so many leaders fall short? And I'm thinking especially, I mean, certainly, unfortunately, sometimes in the church, but I'm thinking more so just like worldwide, like in politics, or in, that we certainly can relate to that today, and another interesting contrast to me is that we can compare Macbeth to King Saul in the Bible.
Oh, yeah.
And one chapter that Ryken points out is 1 Samuel 28. I won't read, it's a long chapter, I won't read it, but basically in that chapter, Samuel dies and Saul is in distress and thinks his enemies are going to get him, and so he seeks out like mediums to kind of help him, and it's very similar to Macbeth. And then he's in this great distress, and he you kind of see this like great psychological distress that he's under, and likewise Macbeth is paranoid, and he's worried about this rivalry to his throne, and that the throne's going to be taken away from him. And so there's a lot of parallelism to King Saul. And then in general, like the Old Testament especially is just replete with evil rulers who are not leading in a way that God is honored.
Yeah. And I think, we can just look through, like you were saying, like historically, there's just been a lot of Macbeth is not all that surprising when we look at just world history too. There's been plenty of leaders like that,
and how maybe ambition and power especially tend to corrupt. And, not always, but a lot of
certainly
times.
Can. And I think too, just like looking at those virtues, I think we all long for leadership like that, and I think that as Christians, we do have this beautiful example in Christ. And so, I think it really is interesting to look at Macbeth and see sort of this case of, well, that's terrible and we don't want that. And then to look at Christ and be like, look how different and beautiful he is as a leader. And I just think that's an interesting, I don't know, it's just, it highlights a lot of who Christ is and how otherworldly he is. I think also, Ryken mentions this too, that just the Macbeth's marriage is a really interesting case study. Yeah. There is sort of like this parallel to Jezebel and this sort of ambitious couple that sort of grow closer in their evil together.
Right.
Yeah. So what were your thoughts on that? Like, what did you take away from that?
Yeah, I found their marriage relationship really interesting, and it is kind of a contrast to, or it's certainly a contrast to the way the Bible talks about marriage and what a godly marriage looks like, and like I think of like the Proverbs 31 woman, she does her husband good all the days of her life. Like they're doing the opposite of that, and they really are like partners in crime, like spurring each other on towards evil. And Macbeth is certainly in the beginning of the play very dominated by his wife, and she is kind of the one. I mean, there's multiple factors at play, but she's certainly one of the factors that leads him or convinces him to do this evil act. I mean, he did it of his own volition, but she really like kind of
battered him almost.
Nails the hammer down. And then it's interesting because they, it seems like that kind of spurring each other on towards evil really, it certainly leads to the destruction of, I would say, of their marriage and of their relationship. And
yeah, I think it's really interesting that she sort of even, she recognizes virtue in Macbeth, and she despises it, because she, in Act 1, Scene 5, it's before they've killed Duncan, she says, "Yet do I fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness." So she rejects the fact that he's too kind to commit murder, and she like holds that against him.
Right.
And then she sort of, because she thinks he's not going to follow through on this, she calls upon dark forces. And in a lot of the way that Shakespeare paints it, it's sort of her casting off a womanly virtue of kindness and nurturing. I think it's a really interesting and really dark speech that she says. I think it's worth reading. So she says, she's calling on these demonic forces. She says, "Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here, and fill me from the crown to the top full of direst cruelty. Make thick my blood, stop up the access and passage to remorse, that no compunctious visitings of nature shake my fell purpose or keep peace between the effect and it. Come to my woman's breast and take the milk for gall." So it's a really interesting picture of sort of her hating this like nurturing concept of womanhood in order to go commit murder, which I just think is a really interesting. I think Shakespeare just does a lot of interesting thing with women characters in general. And I think Lady Macbeth is just a really interesting study of a woman that is so caught up in vice.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and we find out later in the play that she has committed suicide, or there's allusion to that. And so one of the last scenes, and another, I guess probably Macbeth's most famous soliloquy, one of his servants comes and announces to him that the queen, his queen, Lady Macbeth, is dead. And so Macbeth's first thing that he says is that she should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. And then that kind of the next part, he goes into his famous soliloquy, which I'll let you get to in a second. But I just firstly found that so interesting that first of all, there's a lot of different interpretations on what that could mean. Like, does it mean she should have lived a longer life? That would be like the nicest interpretation. Right. Or does it mean like it doesn't matter that she died because everyone dies? You know, we don't know exactly. It is kind of a play on words. We don't know exactly the meaning, but regardless, it shows kind of the cruel end of their relationship, that it means nothing to him, essentially, that she's dead. And again, just shows that the destruction of sin and of evil. So why don't you go into the kind of the rest of that soliloquy, which is very significant, I think.
Yeah, so I'll just jump into it. So tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And one of the things that Ryken says in Realms of Gold, which I thought was really interesting about this soliloquy specifically, is it's one of the most memorable expressions in literature of the futility and meaningless of life. Macbeth here denies a basic premise of existence, that life has meaning. But Macbeth stops short of an awareness of personal wrongdoing or sinfulness. And I just think it's really, I mean, it's beautiful. Like, the poetry of it is beautiful, but it is such like it is just this nihilistic statement of there is no meaning, which I think you see in the way that Macbeth, I think he's an interesting study of someone who is racked with guilt and is destroyed by the guilt of what he's done and never repents. And part of that is this understanding that he has, there is no divine thing he answers to. Right. And so it's such an interesting contrast of someone who is repentant and does recognize the afterlife. If you were to like read Hamlet, it's such a different study between the two. And almost like Macbeth almost reminds me of Judas in that way, where it's like he recognizes what he's done is wrong, and yet still doesn't take personal responsibility, and certainly doesn't turn to Christ or in order to be cleansed from it, which he could be. Right.
Yeah, like this is the section where you would expect, or you would want him to be to repent, essentially, and he doesn't. Like, and it made me think of, I thought of like Ecclesiastes and like vanity of vanities, all of life is vanity, and just that kind of a similar idea that he's saying, like, yeah, life is meaningless tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, and that this is where you would want him to, I think Ryken brings up, like, do what David did in Psalm 51, like have this like reversal, this repentance and this confession to the Lord, and that certainly isn't what happens. And it does seem like undergirding that is his view of life as meaningless, why would he do that? If he views life as signifying nothing.
I think in all reading the whole play, one of the things that might be maybe a temptation that could prevent us from being, I don't know, impacted by it is to think that we are so unlike Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and to think that, well, we would never do something so evil. But I think a lot of the point that Shakespeare is getting at is just how easy it is for us to fall into sin and into such wickedness, and that temptation is a very real reality.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important for us to look at Macbeth, especially in the earlier part of the play, and to see that he is beloved and he is virtuous, and his wife even hates his virtue, and yet he allows temptation to overcome him, and then he just continues in sin unrepentant.
Yeah.
And so I think in reading Macbeth, we can take that piece to heart of fleeing temptation and repenting of sin.
Yes, good word. I think that's a good word to end on. So with that, we will end for this episode. As always, if you have any feedback, we would love to hear from you, and we hope that you will join us for our next episode. Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like access to more resources, we have a website at allthingspodcast.org. We hope that you'll join us for our next episode.